I read There's a River in 51 and visited Virginia Beach in 53. I had a temporary duty assignment that had me in that area for 3 weeks. And so I stayed at the old Cayce home. And two things were the important there. I met a lot of the old timers who got readings. And the other is they loaded me up. So when the military sent me overseas, I had a stack of Cayce readings 3 or 4 inches thick, And one of those was an early version of the Cayce interpretation of the Revelation of John. And as you know, the Revelation features the 7 churches as the 7 spiritual centers. And the readings also say that when Jesus gave the Lord's Prayer, he gave it for the purpose of awakening the sinners. In other words, it's a mantra to awaken the sinners. And the way that goes is the 7 centers, Leiden, gonads, Leiden, adrenal, thymus, thyroid, pineal, pituitary. And so what Cayce does is associates the Lord's Prayer with these. For example, Our Father which art in heaven, pituitary, hallowed be thy name, pineal. That's really important. Hallowed be thy name, pineal. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, thyroid. Then it skips from the higher 3 to the lower. Give us this day our daily bread, gonads. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, adrenal. Then the Leiden. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Evil is the thymus. It's a center of self and self-concern. For thine is the kingdom, thyroid, the kingdom and the power. Now this pineal being the power, there's power in the blood. And then the pituitary is the father. Kingdom, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. This association of the revelation with the Lord's Prayer with these centers is what became my study in 1953. And in the past 70 years, I've been trying to figure it out and work with it. But I've worked a great deal with the idea of these 7 centers. So I think of the Lord's Prayer as a archetypal pattern. And so if it's an archetypal, then I raise the question, well, what about, there's the classic 23rd Psalm. What about the 23rd Psalm? And I began working on it, and I figured out a relationship of the way in which the 23rd Psalm addresses the 7 centers in the same way, addressing the higher 3, the lower 4, the higher 3. And in the 23rd Psalm, we say, he anoints my head with oil, my cup runneth over. And so for years, I kept thinking, he anoints my head with oil, pineal, my cup runneth over, pituitary. And then I found something maybe 7 or 8 years ago. In the Search for God, it says the energies rise to the pineal and overflow. So there are 12 major structures of the body, the heart, the circulatory system, the lungs, the respiratory system, and the bones. And so of these 12 major parts of the body, let me get my drawing back here again. When it says, he anoints my head with oil, my cup overfloweth, that's the way I'd figured out the 23rd Psalm until I looked at this carefully. And this was years later. I mean, like, I'd been doing the Search of God I'd gone through it for decades until I saw this. It says the energy rises to the pineal and overflows. So there are 12 major parts of the body, and each of those 12 structures, like the bones, the muscles, the ligaments, tendons, joints, they all have, by the revelation, 144,000, 12,000 perfect cells in each of those major structures. So what happens is the energies rise and overflow from the pineal, and then that's attunes the whole body. And then the energy, it says, then it rises to the pituitary, where it can be disseminated on the wings of thought. So the meditation is so tremendously important in prayer, because as those energies rise, then and they overflow and attune the body, and then it sends on up to the pituitary. That empowers the prayer. The Christ energies prepare that system to be a source. The pituitary, he says, you feel it in the middle of the forehead. Those, at that point, you can send it out for healing. So the prayers, all of your prayers may work, but the power prayer is going to be when the energies are fully raised, the body is attuned to the pineal secretions. So when we read it, the power in the blood, the power is in the blood that has these, as the energy rises from the gonads, each of these centers, which are endocrine centers, make a contribution. And when you get to the pineal, I call it an elixir. That elixir, that special, flows over, tunes up the body, and prepares you. So when we say, when we always say our prayer in the name of Christ, in what name? We just say, oh, and I have to add in the name of Christ for it to work. Well, I don't think you have to do that for your prayers to be effective, but for them to be efficacious, this is the name. Where thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, or the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. The Son is this pineal is the Christ center. And when the energies rises to that level, then you have empowered prayer. So I think that's just tremendously important, and you don't get that ordinarily. So what the readings say about when the energies reach here, and you can feel it, is that it's disseminated on the wings of thought, disseminated on the wings of thought. Now, what I've been doing actually for the past decade, I have read this book, Meditation Part 1, which is the healing group readings, the 281 series. All of the healing group readings are in this book. They're in the Revelation. They're readings about prayer. There's readings about the endocrine system, the laws of spiritual healing. And I've read this book cover to cover 7 times. And then this one, which is supportive of that, I've read this 11 times. And I can tell you, every time I read it, I get something new. I learn something new. So this is just absolutely imperative. And what I've learned first is that almost as a definition of pure spirituality, if you want to define spirituality, some people say, oh, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. What does that mean? Well, the key word is intention. What is the intention? And this is what Cayce calls the first cause, is the end. What is the intention? I've been, without having a full understanding of this, I've been saying for years, 2 men give a university $1 million for a building, one because he's interested in education, the other because he wants his name on the building. That building will forever have the vibes of the intention of the donor. So this intention is the first cause. Regarding psychic phenomena, regarding healing, regarding the way in which we're able to do this, the readings say there must be in the physical or mental world a channel through which psychic or spiritual forces may manifest. It must become concrete or definite with some channel, some manner of manifestation. The anatomical condition of the human body lends itself to such an experience. So what he's saying is, it's not just spiritual. Meditation not just spiritual. It involves the physical body and the physical processes in the body, and those endocrine secretions that attune you have physical contacts. The anatomical condition of the human body lends itself to such an experience. That, as is known in the human organism or mammal or animal or vegetable or mineral even, that's known as the germ of which propagation is made, must be and is the source from which there must be the contact. So the contact with the spirit into the physical, it has to be made through that is the creative part of our system. So the Leiden is the creative center, and at the moment of conception, because half of the genes come from the male and half from the female, at the moment of conception, you have a single cell. Now, when that cell divides, it immediately becomes, one end of it is the Leiden and the other is the pineal. And Cayce speaks of the long thread activity. So it's just one cell, really. He says the pineal goes from the feet to the top of the head. But he speaks of this long thread activity in which this Leiden pineal connection remains one cell. Now then, to get the attunement, you see, how did these get separated? That's the question. How did we come to be apart? And let me pursue that a little. So I told you I'd read this several times, 7 times. There was a passage in it where I just kept skipping over. And I didn't understand it. I didn't bother with it. And about 5 years ago, in one of these readings, I came of the book. I said, I'm going to figure this out. So what he says is, in continuing with the subject, and we come now to the application, that of which has been indicated, let that which is given here and now not become confusing, for it will require deep meditation upon such that you may get the correct insight, which you will not be able to put into words at first, and will know when you know, but by the experience of coordinating physical, mental, and spiritual into one. For as given, few have conceived or attempted to analyze the effect created in a physical body through the mental impressions received. Few have conceded that there is an activity that may go on as an active force within a human body. So we need to be clear that the attunement is physical process. It relates to those secretions. So now here's what's going to be hard to understand. He says this is going to take a lot of meditation and study. Is the first cause then that's a separation of God in the development of companion with himself, that as created or brought into material manifestation, the reverse of love, of hope, of patience, of the attributes that are spiritual activity, the moving influences. This we see manifested in the physical body through the glandular system as the activity of conception, the dividing of the activity of the gland itself that brings conception. So what he's saying is, you've all heard that we as souls were created because of God's desire for companionship. Now, what this says, it's going to be hard to understand, is that God's desire of companionship, that's the first cause, his desire. And as that first cause, as he manifests himself as souls, and Christian theology, none of which is biblical. Christian theology says we were created out of nothing. The readings say, and the Bible says, we came out of God. So in manifesting his desire for companionship, as that was the first cause, that was the intention. So we as his children have that same thing. He desired to have companionship outside of himself. We then have that same desire to have companionship out of ourselves, which is why we desire children. And this desire to have companionship, what Cayce says is the first impulse in which souls were created, and we were not given free will. We had free will because we're God beings. He says, some had the desire to do evil from the outset. Some's desire to so the minute, like in Isaiah in the Old Testament, it speaks of Lucifer, who, by the way, is not a fallen angel. The Bible calls him a man. Is this the man? But Lucifer says, I will, I will, I will. So the problem is God desired companionship, and we desire our expression outside of ourselves. And so we choose outside of God instead of turning back to our source and seeking companionship with him. That's the problem. Self is the ultimate problem. And that's why in the 7 centers, this heart center is so much associated with the self. So the conceived, then the first movement along that center or gland, which either fades or becomes a channel along which they may move the power and the might to find expression through the very organs of the body. So that it starts in the Leiden and says, then the next is the pineal, through which the brain forces manifest. Either it's the combination of activity of the glands. The choice in its activity is as separated itself from the first cause of the first premise by the very will of the Father God in the beginning. So God knew, actually he knew, he runs the risk, so to speak. He desires companionship. He knows that the souls that he creates may make choices outside of his love, but he runs that risk, as it were, with the intention. And the Cayce readings say, and the Bible says, God is not willing that any soul should perish. So right now we have an amazing information from the astronomers about the magnitude of the physical universe. And Cayce speaks of universes, plural, but just imagine actually the unimaginable magnitude of the physical universe. And then Cayce says, there is soul entrapment throughout the universe. And he speaks of Arcturus, which is a space of light. And he says souls come from the Pleiades, from Orion. He calls the Orion people oxides or ox-headed. There's a problem with those from Orion. But we have here on the planet Earth souls like the Arcturian Cayce. He went to Arcturus, which is the center from which we can move out of this system. We're in the solar system, and we have sojourns in all of these 7 planets. So the planet Mars is related to war and anger and wrath. The planet Venus related to self and love and music. The planet Uranus related to psychic powers and will and choice. The planet for the pineal is Mercury, the mind. And the Cayce readings are so big on the importance of the mind. It's intermediate between the physical body and the soul. Few, as given, have conceived of or attempted to analyze the effect created in the physical body through the mental expressions received, or conceded that there is an activity in the human body. So the first cause, now let me read this that he said is going to be so difficult to understand, and it was. As I said, I just read it and skip over it, and then I said, I'm going to figure this out. So here's the difficult part. This we see manifested in the physical body through the glandular system, the dividing of the activity of the gland itself and bringing conception. Thus, then, is the first of the centers through which all arises that movement as to bring into being both the face and the preface. Thus, the first of the centers is the Leiden. Conceive then the first movement along the center of gland, which either fades or becomes a channel along which there may move the power and the might. So this channel, the power may move through these centers. The reason it's so tremendously important for us to be forgiving is because the adrenal center is the center of anger or hate or what have you. And if you're holding something against a person and you try to meditate, it stops there. It splays out because this center is dedicated to anger instead of attunement. So we have to really be powerful in our forgiveness. And that includes ourselves. We must never condemn others nor condemn yourself. But the energy will stop there unless we are fully forgiving, and then it rises on up. We don't want to be selfish, so we rise on up there. We don't want to be self-willed. It stops there. We want it to rise up to this Christ center. So concluding about this principle, as we've indicated, much study, much meditation is needed here. Much has been given. As it is better understood, papers may be prepared on same, which would prove not only interesting, but most beneficial. Continue with the study of same. So as you understand it, papers may be written. So that's where this book came from. It's out of that study of this origin of the souls and the creation of souls that says, as it's understood, more may be written. So all of that I'm sharing with you is pretty much developed in the psychology of the soul. And by the way, if you can't get it on Amazon, just write to me, hpuryear@logoscenter.org, hpuryear@logoscenter.org. Get a pen and paper, and I'll show this to you later. So if you want to ask me questions or ask about the book, hpuryear@logoscenter.org.
Herb, it's Larry. There's a question in the chat, and what you've said so far about when the egg is first fertilized and the cell is split. How do identical twins fit into this? Can you comment? Is there anything about identical twins?
Yes, let me develop that a little. Just as when God created us, so when a man and a woman come together and create a child, what Cayce says, the ideal of each person, it's actually at that moment of conception, which sperm does the ovum choose, and it chooses. And the ideal of the parents, when they come together to have a child, that at that intention, the intention at that moment has an effect on what type of soul will be drawn to that couple. So the intention is a determining factor of the biochemistry of the ovum, the biochemistry of the sperm. You know, it's not just a random sperm, it's a selected sperm that the ovum accepts. And at that moment, the intention of the two come together, the ideal is going to choose what type of soul will be attracted. Now, in the 281 series, there are 12 readings on the endocrine glands, and as examples of that, he uses biblical characters. For example, Abraham and Sarah had the perfect ideal when Isaac came to them, and he was ethereal. Now, what about Jacob and Esau? The ideal of the father was a man of the woods, a man of the fields. The ideal of the mother was a spiritual man. And so the ideals, the intention of the parents were different. Now, he says it's not always the case with twins, but in this particular instance, it was the case that the father had one ideal, the mother had another, and they had twins that had different types of, the different types of soul, two different types of souls were drawn to them. Further question about that, Larry?
The question just said, what about identical twin? It's Dawn who asked the question. Maybe she could expand on it a little bit. That's all she said.
Well,
identical twin.
When you have identical twins, you may have different ideals and intentions of the two partners. Now, that's not always the case, but when you have identical twins, or when you have twins like Jacob and Esau, I would say more likely that the ideals in identical twins, the ideals may be the same, but there's other kind of expectation. So in identical twins, you do have two different souls.
Yeah.
And they're drawn to that couple for different reasons. But the effect of the intention of the come together couple has a tremendous effect on the type of soul that will be drawn to that union.
Thank you.
Now, I want to pick up with a little different.
John Schroeder has a question whether or not the difference between Lilith and Eve.
Well, Eve was an individual person, and like a human being, whereas Lilith preceded that. You know, in the Atlantean times, and one of the reasons we don't find a lot of Atlantean artifacts is we had not solidified the physical body as much, and so Lilith is less of a physical being than Eve was. it's the same spiritual concept, Eve and Lilith, but Lilith was more of a spiritual influence coming in, whereas Eve was an actual incarnation of a soul.
Thank you.
So, picking up, the spirit and the soul is within its encasement or its temple within the body of the individual. With the arousing then of this image, the image of the Christ, the ideal. Now, we're talking about meditation. In meditation, with the arousing of the image, which is the Christ center, it rises along that which is known as the Appian Way or the pineal center to the base of the brain, that it may be disseminated to those centers that give activity to the whole of the mental and physical being. So that's what I've been explaining to you. The energy rises and comes to the pineal center, where it's disseminated to the 12 parts of the body, the 12 perfect cells, to attune those. It rises then to the hidden eye in the center of the brain system, or is felt in the forehead of the head, or the place above the real face, or the bridge of the nose. So this is the reading from the 282 series that was so important to me in saying it rises first the pineal, it overflows, and then it rises up to be disseminated from the pituitary. Now, why meditate? And most people, when I was at the beach, there was a woman that came every Wednesday morning to the prayer group meeting to pray because she felt a rush, like a sexual rush when she meditated. She did that for that purpose. And Cayce warns against this. This must be raised only for spiritual purposes. The power of prayer. Remember, the energy rises to the pineal and then to the pituitary, where it's disseminated. Would that all men would know, much more may be accomplished through prayer. Would that all would know, much more may be accomplished through prayer than through all the might and power of men. Though the worlds may pass away, his word will not pass away. For as he is given, as you ask in my name, believing, so it shall be done to thee. Now, I'm qualifying this asking in the name, because who of us hadn't had the experience of saying a prayer and saying in the name of Christ and it doesn't come to pass? Sometimes it does, but for it to come to pass, the energies need to be raised, activated the pineal, then raise the pituitary where it's disseminated. So when this energy rises up to the pineal and pituitary and is disseminated there, he says there may be instant healing. You can lay on hands and there's instant healing. I tell people, when you think about healing, think physics, not biology. It's hard to think of a cancer kind of disappearing biologically, but in physics. I knew Olga Worrell. She had the reputation of being a great healer. I went to her once and she had powerful healing hands. She said once she had laid her hands on a woman who had a cancer the size of a tennis ball in her breast. And she said she just laid her hands there and just felt it disappearing under her hands. It just melted away. So when you raise these energies up to this level, you can become a healer with prayer, with laying on of hands. That's the power of prayer. Now, when we're told more can be accomplished through prayer, we're talking about meditation attuned prayer, and it can accomplish miracles. So every one of us, and especially working with the Search for God, those affirmations, you want to memorize those affirmations because they are like mantra. They have several seed syllables. They're a mantra that is for the purpose of raising these energies. And so the Search for God material is excellent, especially with the affirmations and the meditation, to make of us healers. You may remember in 1931, Cayce gave the first study group reading. And the next day, he gave another reading, 262-2. And he closes that reading by saying, it's a dying world. It's a dying world. Remember, in 1922 at Versailles, President Wilson at the League of Nations, he said a lot of people were critical of Wilson, but at that conference table in Versailles, he says this Christ was sitting in that presence. And if the United States have bought in on that League of Nations, it would have been the end of wars. But he says, Christ crucified again out of greed, on the power of greed. So greed kept us from doing that. Christ crucified again. And then we have the dying world. And what we are to do, this is what you want to have your study group get a sense of. We are to prepare the way for the preservation of these truths, especially regarding Christ, for coming ages. And by the way, one of the most sobering words in the readings to me is the word eons. He says, we have been in existence for eons. If you go back, let's say the creation of the physical universe is like 8 or 9 billion years. God was before that, and we were before that. We were with him in the beginning, when he created us. So this soul entrapment throughout the universe, when we accomplish or overcome here and have finished our jobs here and go to Arcturus, then we may return if we want to help, like Cayce did, or it says we can go on to other systems. So the experience of us in the solar system is not just in the Earth plane. We have sojourns on all 7 centers. And that illustrates the complexity of the relationship of souls to God. We can't even imagine the consciousness that we would have if all centers were, but we're told that Jesus went to all of these 7 planets to prepare a place. So he's perfect in wrath in Mars and perfect in love in Venus. So we have this challenge to experience through these 7 dimensions, but the way we get there is through the attunement we can make in meditation to bring up these forces. Now, I want to read something to you from The Secret of the Golden Flower. And I talk about this quite a bit in the book. It talks about the parents, and it says, before the parents have begotten the child, the breath of life is complete and the embryo is perfect. But when the embryo moves and the embryo vesicle, he's going to use the word vesicle. Before the parents have begotten the child, the breath of the life is complete and the embryo perfect. But when the embryo moves and the embryo vesicle is torn, it is as if man lost his footing on a high mountain, and with a cry, the man plunges down to earth. And from then on, human nature and life are divided. From this moment, human nature can no longer see life nor human nature. And now, get this, this is scary. And now fate takes its course. Youth passes over into maturity, maturity into old age, and old age into woe. And another, it says, within the germinal vessel is the fire of the ruler. The entrance of the germinal vesicle is in the fire of the minister. When the three fires express themselves in this order, man develops. So the point is that the secret of the golden power says these two must be brought together. If they're not, then the consciousness stays in the lower center, and you may go for incarnation after incarnation and never awaken really until this takes place. This is why it's so vital for all of us who understand this to be meditators and bring this up. You know, the church teaches believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, your Savior, and you'll be saved. But Jesus said, narrow is the way and straight is the gate, and few there are that enter. So the narrowness of the gate is, and straight is the way. This is the way to bring these into oneness. How did they get separated? When God's desire for companionship came into manifestation, we became a half of it were, and then there was another half. We are astray and we need to return. Are there questions about this? More about prayer. Pray often for those who've passed on. This is part of your consciousness. It is well. For God is God of the living. Those who pass through God's other door are oft listening for the voice of those they have loved in the earth. The nearest and dearest thing they have been conscious of in earthly experience. And the prayers of others that are still in the earth may ascend to the throne of God, and the angel of each entity stands before the throne to make intercession. Not a physical throne, but that consciousness. So get this. Those that we've loved and gone the spirit plane, they need our prayers, and our prayers can be of help to them. Those who passed on need the prayers of those who live aright. For the prayers of those who would be righteous in spirit may save many who've erred even on high. So we may, through our prayers, even be of help to those of our loved ones in the spirit plane that didn't go in full attunement.
There's a question, this is Larry again, about prayer.
Yeah.
What's the purpose? Let me read the question. What is the purpose of prayer? Would a loving God withhold anything from his children? And wouldn't he know our needs before we ask? That's the question.
Well, the problem is, who of us has not known the will of God and we chose otherwise? You know, I do this every day. I know I ought to do this for my attunement and well-being, but I want to do this. So the prayer is to aid the seeker in moving toward his best desire, but no, God doesn't just automatically meet the needs, or we would all be well, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
God is fully loving, and he's eager to heal us and help us and bring us in accord, but we have to be open. And meditation and prayer is a way of opening ourselves to his love. And it's a way of opening ourselves to love that we can send that love to others. No, there's work to be done here. It's like I said earlier, just to say, "Oh, I pray in the name of Christ." That's a kind of a trite kind of thing. Are we really praying in the Spirit of Christ? And if so, we need to have had that energy raised up to the Christ center. I wanted to talk about some contemporary questions about none of Christianity is biblical. I'm great on the Bible. Cayce's great on the Bible. The Bible is the important book for us. Not that you believe it so much, but there are elements in it that are vital to us. So in the Bible, there are comments about homosexuality, and people are actually killing others because of that. So in Romans 1, it mentions that men have leaving the natural use of the woman and so on. But then I tell people, Cayce recommends the full book of Romans. You read Romans 1, you must read the second chapter, because the second chapter says, therefore, you are inexcusable, O man, whosoever you are, that judge. For wherein you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you that judge do the same thing. So actually, Pope Francis is moving in this direction. He's not judging. He's saying these are souls, but to judge those, you need to read chapter 2 of Romans. Therefore, O man, you're without excuse if you judge another. Now, another thing is about abortion. And I'm reading from Exodus 21. Exodus 20 is the book that has the 10 Commandments. Exodus 21, here's some verses. Whosoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. Whosoever curses father or mother shall be put to death. And then 2 verses later, that was 15 and 17, in 22, verse 22. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. So the God of the 10 Commandments wasn't all that upset about a miscarriage being caused. So this idea that the minute of conception, there's a person there, it's not backed up in the Bible or in the readings. What an abortion does is delays the opportunity for a soul to have a vehicle to incarnate in. But you're not killing a soul, you're not killing a person, you're delaying the opportunity for a soul to incarnate. I want to say 4 things about Christian theology, none of which are biblical. The main thing is this craziness of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. What Christian theology says, and this is the heart of the worldview, that God created the universe and us as souls out of nothing. And so they call us creatures. And yet, in the Psalm, it says, you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. And Jesus quotes that. He says, doesn't your own law say you are gods? But as I point out early in the book of the infinite and the finite, Christian theologians are even condemning of the notion that we are God beings. And so we have Christian theology saying we're creatures. Then there are 3 things. The Trinity. No, not God in person. God is not a person. They ask, should we think of him as an infinite force or as one caring about our individual souls? And it says both. He is both the God of the universes, but he's the God of that cares for us as his children. A second premise of Christian theology is the incarnation, that God incarnated in Jesus. Now, the Bible says, he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified are all of one origin. That's why he's not ashamed to call them brethren. So whatever kind of being Jesus was or became is the kind of being that we are and are to become. And we are children of the Most High. So there's the ex nihilo, there's the Trinity, there's the incarnation, and then the worst of them is what they call vicarious atonement. And this is crazy thing in Christian theology, but basic Christians say man sinned so terribly that God can't even look on sin. So he sent his son to live a perfect life. And by living the perfect life and sacrificing his life, then that would be enough sacrifice to appease God, and he could forgive us. And that's savage, that's horrid, that's primitive. God is not willing that any souls should perish. But the idea of vicarious atonement, what really saves us, I'm reading from the 10th chapter of Hebrews. Wherefore, when he came into the world, he said, this is Jesus, he said, sacrifice and offering thou wouldst not, but a body thou hast prepared. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, thou hast no pleasure. See, this idea that in the Old Testament they sacrifice animals, and in the New Testament God sacrificed Jesus. No, God takes no pleasure in sacrifices. It says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, I have no pleasure. Then said I, this is Jesus, the Christ. Then said I, lo, I come in the volume of the book. It is written of me to do thy will. This is Psalm 40, to do thy will. And then Hebrews 10 says, above, when he said sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings and offering for sin, thou wouldst not, neither hadst thou pleasure therein, which are offered by the law. Then said he, lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He takes away the first, that he may establish the second. Now guess this, by which will we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. So it was Jesus's will to do God's will and to live a perfect life, to manifest an archetypal pattern for us. You know, the Deuteronomy 30, this law which I command you is written. It's not far away, it's written within. There's a pattern within us to be Christ beings. And he came that we might, by his will, that we might have access to that pattern. So the ways in which Christianity is not biblical include the plan of salvation. The plan of salvation is that Jesus lived a perfect life, fulfilled the archetypal pattern of the God pattern within us, and that makes it more accessible to us. Remember, on the cross, it says when he gave up the ghost, the curtain in the tabernacle was rent. And that means we are the temple, we're the tabernacle, that we have a nearer access to the Spirit of Christ by that curtain being removed.
There's it's Larry, Herb, there's a question. Yeah. If Jesus' crucifixion was not for our atonement, then why was he crucified?
Well, he was for our atonement, but not vicarious atonement. He was crucified because he lived the will. You see, you understand about what the priests and the Sadducees, what they had against him. He said, I mentioned earlier, the psalmist says, "You are God's children, the Most High." And when they accused Jesus, he says, "Doesn't your own law say you are God's?" He was crucified because he was blasphemous, because he said, "I'm a God being." And that was against their law. And they said, if you claim to be God, they planned to destroy him because of that teaching. You are God's, you and brothers and sisters. Is there a further question about this? Have I clarified it?
It's Diane. I don't know if she wishes to add anything to it. I read the question the way, so I think you answered the question, at least the way it was written.
The sacrifice of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, was not required by God. It was required by man in his rebelliousness to do away with a person who said, God is my Father and I am one with the Father. That was blasphemy. And that's today's Christianity. Today's Christians are offended. And I developed this quite fully in the first section of the book, From the Infinite to the Finite. Christian theology is really offended by the notion that we're God beings. And that's what Jesus came to teach us. Further question, comments?
Yeah, I have a comment, Herb. This is David.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that is important about Jesus' crucifixion is also that his example was to come into the world to show love in every possible way that he could, to be in a complete accordance with God's law of love.
Exactly.
And crucifixion was like one of the most horrible ways to die in that time period. Generally a great embarrassment, degradation, plus horrible torment. And what does he do when he's crucified? He says, "Father, forgive them because they know not what they do." He doesn't curse them. He doesn't blame them. He shows his attunement even in the worst of circumstances. And I think
backing up a little, David.
Go ahead, sir.
Backing up a little. In the garden, he prays, "Let this cup pass, nevertheless, not my will, but thine." So the will is to, the readings say he could have destroyed them with a word, but he is, as you're pointing out, and I think the difficult thing when he said, "Let this cup pass," what he was shedding tears was, it was so important for him on the cross not to blame or not to condemn those. So he says, "Neither do I condemn thee. Father, be merciful to them." See, that was the big test. The final test is when he says, "Not my will, but thine," is can he suffer that kind of thing and not be condemning of them? And that means inside of himself as well as not saying it. And he knew, I have to be forgiving at this really difficult time to fulfill God's
I think the readings say that his time in the garden was his greatest trial.
Yes, because he came to be at peace with the idea of God's will, which was not to be condemning of those who crucified him.
Thank you, Herb.
Yes. I do want to tell you a little about the Edgar Cayce primer. I don't know why A.R.E. doesn't carry it anymore, but It was published 40 years ago, and it's still really important. For 3 years, I wrote a lesson a month, 36 lessons called Covenant. They were like newsletter size that went out to the members. And 27 of those 36 are in this book, the Edgar Cayce Primer. So the idea of the Covenant series was, I went into the field so many times, and people had been study group work for 10 years and didn't have a sense of some basic principles. So I wrote that series, and then the book came out of this. Basic notions about reincarnation, meditation, prayer, and so on. Now, later coming out here, I wrote Why Jesus Taught Reincarnation. This book is self-published. It's available only through me. I was talking with Larry earlier, and when I first got to the beach in the 80s, 82 or 3, the first book came out was Meditation and the Mind of Man. Now, I don't think this is available anymore, but we did publish a book on meditation based on this tremendous importance that the readings place on it.